Okay, so we've got all of our maps baked out, which includes the ambient occlusion, the color map, the full render map, which we may or may not use, but it's nice to have if needed, and the normal map. And then I also have these two textures here, which I've already downloaded, that are from CG Textures. And we're going to use these as extra detail to then add detail to the textures. So at this point, I'm going to jump over to Photoshop, and let me just pull it up here. And keep in mind, again, that everything that I'm going to be doing can be done in Photoshop, in GIMP, in Pixelmator, whatever your choice of image editing application is. In this case, I'm going to be using Photoshop particularly because of one tool, namely Content-Aware Fill, which is really, really cool and does some cool stuff. But I'm going to show you how to do all the same stuff without Content-Aware Fill, and it shouldn't cause any problems for any of you. One other thing to note, I particularly use Photoshop now since it is available from a subscription service for just like, I think it's like $20 a month or something. So not bad at all for the tools that it gives you. That being said, you can of course use GIMP or Pixelmator if you choose. So going in, I'm just going to open up my file. And in this case, we're not going to use the eat sheep stuff. Let me just navigate here real quick like. And through this mess. This is all the Unity stuff that we're going to be setting up here in a little bit, but for now we're going into the dev folder in textures, and I'm just going to go ahead and open up all of these textures. So I'm going to open them all up. They'll load in as separate images. There we are. Perfect. Okay, so we're just going to choose one of these. It really doesn't matter which one, and we're going to go ahead and hit in my case, Command-Shift-S, or if you're on a Windows machine, Control-Shift-S or Linux, and we're going to go ahead and save this then as Hydrant _ Diffuse, and we're going to save it as a Photoshop file. So save. There we go. Okay, so this is then going to be my base starting point. So let me open up my Layers tab here, and let's just jump over to our Color tab. We're going to hit Command-A to select everything, Command-C to copy, and then back on our Diffuse channel, Command-Shift-V to paste it in place. Then we're going to do the same thing. We don't need to do this on the normal one. We will do it on the full render. Select everything, copy, Command-Shift-V. Let's name these as AO, as color, as full render. And then that should be fine. Then we're going to go ahead and grab this as well, copy, and paste, and then we'll do the same thing with this one. Again, both of those come from cgtextures.com. It looks like I pasted the previous one into the wrong layer. I did. Let me close out of that one. I don't need this anymore. I don't need this anymore. I may need that later, but probably not, but we'll copy this and then close it, close this one, and then we'll paste that in. Okay, so this is going to be our Rust layer, or we'll just call it Rust and Rust 01. Rust 01. Okay, so on this one then, what we're going to do is, first of all, let's go ahead and hit Command-T or Control-T, and we're just going to scale this down, holding Shift to fit it into our space. So this is basically going to be our kind of our texture map of sorts that we're going to use to add extra detail to this. But what I want to do is I want to, since this is a limited image and doesn't fill the entire space, I want to fill the rest of the space. So there's two ways to do this. The first way is we're going to do cloning. So I'm just going to bring up my cursor tool here. I'm going to drag this down to the bottom like that. And then I'm going to hold down Alt and click and drag again, and then just paste it up top. And that works quite well. But then what I want to get rid of is basically I want this texture here. I want some of these dots, but I don't want these big patterns in here that really kind of show off exactly what this is, where it's from, etc. So I want to get rid of all those. But I do want to keep them in the case that I want to use them later. So I'm going to first bring up my lasso tool, and I'm just going to kind of draw around these real quick, just like that. I'm going to hit Command-J, and it's just going to duplicate it to a new layer. I'm just going to call this Rust Spots. These two, I can join to a new layer by hitting Command-E, or to basically just merge down, which you can also find from the layer menu. And, well, I thought it was, here it is, merge layers for Command E. And so that just merges them together. But then what I want to do is on this layer, basically I want just this kind of pattern with a little bit of these kind of spots in here filling this entire texture space, because we're basically just going to overlay it over everything. And using the clone stamp, this tool here, and using a rough brush of some kind, something like this, just something that's not a soft edge, just round brush, just anything like this will be fine. And you know what, I'm just going to even I've got some brushes in here from Tim at Concept Cookie for his texture pack. You can get these just from downloading on Concept Cookie, but again, pretty much any rough brush will work. Basically, what we don't want is we don't want smooth round edges. And because what will happen is you'll begin to lose detail as you basically add layer over layer that's been blending between the two. So now I can just hold down Alt, I can sample an area, and then I can just paste over or paint over that other area. Now in this case right now I believe my brush has a lot of scatter on, so let me just disable scattering. There we go. So now I can do this and I should be able to paint right over that, which right now I cannot. Turn off transfer. Alright, something is, well, we're just going to use a different brush. We're going to grab this guy here. Should be fine. Clone stamp. There we go. No, it was working the entire time. I was being an idiot. All the areas that I'm trying to paint are covered by this area here. So there we go. Now I can go back to the brush that I wanted originally, and then I can just paint right over some of these spots. I'm going to use this guy. And then I can just paint right over these by just sampling one of these general areas, and this works quite well. You can just kind of go through all these different areas. Try not to be too consistent with your stamping, or else you're going to start to see patterns showing up in the patterns that you're trying to remove. So this is the way you can do it. GIMP, Pixelmator, basically all good image painting and editing applications have this ability to then just clone these areas out. However, I'm going to use Photoshop, and this is one of the reasons that I pay $20 a month, because I'm going to use the new Content Aware Fill, which I can literally just select this area, and I'm going to hit Shift Delete, and I have this new Fill dialog. I can choose Content Aware, and it's just going to fill that area with basically what it detects in the rest of the image, and done. This is one case where Photoshop wins hands down against anything else, because this works so ridiculously quick. I'm still not convinced it's not just magic. And this is a relatively simple example. It even works on more complex examples. So basically I can just go in here, select the areas that are very apparent and that would show up as repeating patterns if I were to use them more than once throughout a texture, and just fill them with Content Aware very quickly, and we are done. So that's one of the reasons I use Photoshop. Let's get rid of this little guy too. Okay, there we go. So I have my image, and actually, you know what? We want to fill this as well. So I'm going to select that area, hit Shift Delete, Content Aware, and it will fill in the rest there. And there we go. So cool. I have my image here. So this is going to be the base for my texture. Let's find the rust thing there. That's fine. Turn those off, and let's go ahead and turn this off. We're going to turn off the full render, and we're going to start actually putting together our textures. So first of all, in Blender, we have our texture map here, or basically our material, and let's select this, and we're going to, first of all, in Photoshop, I'm going to save out a PNG of this, because basically as I go along, I'm going to continue saving out PNGs of my diffuse, so that then I can load them in Blender. Now we're not going to need to do that in Unity, but Blender does not really read PSDs very well. So here I'm just going to move both of these down a layer. I'm going to load in a new image texture. I'm going to get rid of the preview. I don't care. I'm going to open up a new image inside texture, or actually I can just grab it right here. I'm going to hit Alt-R to refresh this, diffuse PNG, and I think I can do this. Maybe not. That's okay. I'll just click open and choose textures and PNG. Okay. I'm going to set it to map along the UVs. and it's going to affect the color. So there we go. It hasn't changed basically at all, as it should not have. Now in this case, it has the AO baked in, so we don't need to do the AO twice. Really, all we want to see here is we want to see exactly what it looks like with just the color and then the normal. So the AO we can just leave off. All right. Now we're going to, one thing that we want to do in our final scene, you remember that I have the white caps and white top just to add some extra variation. So in here, I'm going to add a new layer, and this is going to be white top. And we're just going to go through and select these areas. So I'm going to go through here, and I'm just going to select all of this. And that's a really messy selection. So actually I'm going to undo that. And instead I'm going to use the polygonal lasso tool because it's a little bit more accurate here and we'll get the job done. So I'm just going to select this, select all these, select like that. You know, it can be a fairly loose selection. Down in the cracks, you're really not going to see it if it happens to be off. There we go. And I'm going to press Alt Delete or Command Delete to fill that with white. Or actually, you know what? We're going to choose a slightly grayish white. So I'm going to hit Shift Delete and fill with a color. This color then, we're going to give it a little tiny hint of yellow, say something like that, kind of an off-white, and then we'll fill with that. That will give us a slightly better color result. And if we just do color, nope, we're not going to do that, but we'll look at this in a moment. So that will be that. Then we're going to do the same thing right down here. I'll fix that little spot here in just a second. And we'll fix that. There we go. Fix that there. And okay, there we go. We'll hit Shift Delete, fill with the color. And that gives us that. Then we need to select the top as well. And get rid of that little spot there. And we'll fill that again with the same color. Okay, now for the color base, currently we're just using the color, but we're going to not do that just yet. We're going to move that up to the top, that up there. And then for this color, this is the white. We also are going to add a red base. So this is going to be red base. And for this, we're going to fill this with a color as well. And this time we're just going to say sample something like that. Like that. And then maybe we'll darken it just a little bit, say somewhere in there. And click OK. So that fills that with a color. We disable this. And we set our ambient occlusion then to multiply. That will allow us to kind of add some additional ambient occlusion there if we want. We can tone that down just a touch. And there we go. So now let's save this. Command-Shift-S. We're going to save out the PNG again. Basically, as we go along, we're going to continuously save out renditions to see how they look in Blender. So then I can just simply, on the Image tab, just hit Reload. And this should reload in. Oh, it's still saving. There we go. Now I can reload. And there we go. We now have white caps. Now, we want to also make this top white. We want to make the bolts white and this top portion. You know, if we look at it in Unity, we can see what we've got. So we need to grab on our white layer. We're going to fill all of this with our white. So let's undo that layer. We're going to sample this color. And then we're going to hit Shift or Alt Delete, fill that with white. Bring back our ambient occlusion layer, and let's select, we'll use our marquee selection on a circle by just pressing M to bring that up. Hold down Alt and Shift, and we can just expand that out. Alt Delete again. And then also using our square marquee, we can select this here, which I believe, let's double check this. Take this back to the image editor. No, we don't want to do the bottom side. That is this here. Okay, so that is good. We can save this, save out our PNG yet again. Replace. Click OK. We're going to let it save. In the meantime, we can then use our color. We may actually not even use this color, but that's okay. We could multiply this if we wanted. Yeah, we're not going to use those just yet. This should be just fine. Let's go ahead. Turn the layer off on one of these. There we go. I set that to multiply. Set that to normal. Save this. Let's check it out in Blender. So we'll reload that texture. And there we go. So already you can start to see that it's looking kind of cool. But right now, the main problem is that it's super clean. So let's go back over here. We're going to turn this layer on. And what we're going to do is we're going to duplicate this. Hide that layer. I always like to basically keep multiple layers to keep them super clean and easy. Make sure that I have revision history. And we're going to desaturate this. So just Command-Shift-U. And then we're going to set this to multiply over everything. And then we're going to tone the opacity way down. Maybe grab, say, something like that. Or actually, you know what? Let's go all the way up first. And we're going to go into the levels, hit Command-L. And it's over on my other monitor. Here we go. And then we're going to adjust these levels. We're going to bring the whites in a lot to brighten it up. Bring the blacks in a little. You can adjust the midtones. Say something like so. Okay, I think that'll work. We can then take down the opacity just a little bit. And then basically just what this has done, it's just given us a little bit of a dirt map to everything. So that's kind of a good starting point. And in fact, you know what we could even do? Let's duplicate this layer down. Let's enable that. And let's just use that as our red color. So then rather than using the red base, we can go in here and we're just going to, actually, you know what? We're going to get rid of our whites as well. So we can set this to be our red base. We can get rid of the red color completely. And then we're going to get Command-U to go into our hue and saturation. And basically, we're just going to make this a little bit more of that kind of fire hydrant red. You know, something kind of like that. We can maybe take the darkness down just a little bit, and that'll probably work pretty good. Then on our whites, since right now the whites are just clean, let's just hit Command-Click on the layer, which will select that. And then with our red layer selected, hit Command-J. That will duplicate a new layer into a new layer with that selection. So then we can turn off our whites. We can hit Command-Shift-U to make those, or desaturate those, and then hit L, Command-L to bring up the layers again, and then let's just brighten those way up. Something like this. We can bring the midtones down a little bit, somewhere in there. Click OK. We'll hit Command-U to bring up the hue and saturation. We can enable colorize, and then we can add in, you know, that kind of hint of yellow, just the tiniest bit of yellow. Somewhere in there. If we Alt-right click on the layer, we can visualize just it, and that looks pretty good. If we compare with our white layer, probably it's a little bright right now, so let's hit Command-L. Let's bring the darks in. Just a bit like that. And then let's save this, and let's save out a PNG. Okay, we'll let that save. While that's saving, let's go ahead. We're going to bring this layer down now. And I'm going to keep the ambient occlusion in general is always going to sit at the top above everything else because it's kind of the last thing that, you know, it just affects the shadows and things like that. That's finished saving, so let's go ahead and check this out in Blender. Save this and then hit Alt-R, refresh that, and immediately, you know, we've got a lot more depth, and this feels, you know, pretty darn good. We've got some seams in the back. We're not going to worry about that just yet. We may not worry about them at all initially. let's bring the white back into here. So let's just go and that's in that layer. I'm just going to Alt-right click, select this, and I'm just going to basically bring up my lasso tool, select this area here, like this, and select my white here, drag that across, bring the ambient occlusion layer back just so we can see it, and add that in just like that. So now Command D, bring everything else back, like this. Okay, there we are. So let's save this. We need to give the white to all of these as well. So again, on here, I'm just going to select a large section here, Alt and drag, bring it over, Command D, Shift S will bring up our clone tool, and we can just paint in those kind of couple of missing areas. Just like that. Perfect. Okay, bring back our red base. Let's save this. And next, that looks good. Next, I want to bring in some of these nasty rust spots. So I'm going to Alt-right click, bring up this layer only. I'm going to select all of these outer sides. And again, you can do this with the clone stamp tool, but I'm going to use the content aware because it's so quick. I'm just going to select all these areas, Shift Delete, fill with content aware, click OK. And I'm not on the right layer. There we are. And this is going to fill all of that. Give it just a moment. There we go. Pretty amazing, if you ask me. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to desaturate this layer, and I'm going to hit Command L to bring up my layers or my levels, and I'm just going to bring up the whites. Basically, I'm trying to bring out these little areas here to make them stand out a little bit more, because basically I'm going to use this to then add in some extra kind of rough spots in our textures. I think that'll work pretty well. Okay, so now I'm going to just set this to multiply. I'm going to bring the red and the white layers back. I can delete the white top there, rename this one white, bring back the AO, and yeah, there we go. Okay, so this is way, way, way too rough, but what I can do now is I can go ahead and add in a layer mask to this by clicking this button, and I'm just going to, with the layer mask selected, I'm going to hit Command Delete, which will just fill it all with black. But then I can go in and choose just kind of a rough brush again, say something like this, and then I can go in, let's turn off scattering on this. There we go. And I can basically just go in and choose the spots that I want to have some nasty rust on them, say such as like the edges of this, and I can then just kind of paint in some white, and that will then just add in kind of those rough spots throughout. Say something like this, you know, maybe these are a little nastier, this is a little nastier on top, there's definitely some rust, you know, along these edges, you know, water's kind of pooling in these areas, so they're going to be rougher. Maybe the tops of the bolts have been pretty roughed up, so I can paint in those. And you know, this is not super accurate, just because I just basically filled it with a generic pattern, but this works really quite well for adding in some rough spots and such. You know, maybe I'll add some along kind of the weld lines, definitely along this edge where maybe water is gathering of sorts. Make that rougher. Along these edges, you know, they're getting kicked. It's people are bumping into them, or you know, maintenance guys or firemen or whatever, or maybe bumping these you know, corners with their hoses, with the boots, wrenches, whatever. So just kind of think about, you know, where areas are going to get more wear than others, and trying to fill in kind of some of those rough spots. And by setting it to multiply and by desaturating that, it's given me, you know, pretty free reign to just kind of fill it in. And it's not changing the tone at all, so I don't have to worry about matching tone. It's just, you know, just lights and darks filling in those rough spots. So it really works quite easily and well. Definitely along here at the base, you know, the base is really going to be rusted, or not, you know, not a whole lot, but you know, it's going to get a lot more splash from cars, from salt, from people kicking it, whatever, dogs peeing on it. So just adding in these kind of rust spots. will give us a nice good grunge to this texture. And definitely then, you know, on the bolts. Okay, and here and here. And I think that looks pretty good. So let's, you know, maybe I'll add in just a little bit right in there. Try to stay away from the edges of your islands or you're going to get pretty apparent seams. All right, that ought to work pretty well. Let's save this. Okay, going to save out the PNG. Okay, almost done. And give it just a minute more. You know, we are working with fairly high resolution sections. There we go. And now jump over in Blender. Let's look at it right now. We see how it looks. If we then reload that texture, immediately, you know, it's much grungier, feels quite a bit better, I think. But there's a couple of things that are still definitely wrong with the texture. Number one, we don't really see any like white ridges around these lines or anything like that, so that feels kind of weird. And number two, we're not getting spec. You know, the spec is just overall, you know, it feels nice and smooth. So it's almost like we have a glossy coating over this whole thing. So we're going to need to create a spec map. But first, let's add in some nice kind of highlights around these ridges. So what I'm going to do back in Photoshop, we're going to add in one more new layer. And this is going to be, we'll just call it ridges. Because we're going to, using this rough brush, and it's kind of yellowish texture, we're just going to paint in. I'm going to soften the edges of the brush by just right-clicking. And, oh, I guess this doesn't actually have a hardness option. That's probably okay. Let's use something a little different then. Maybe something like that. Let's go into our brush settings. We'll add in shape dynamics. We can then choose brush tip shape. Let's increase the spacing here a little bit. And I think that'll feel pretty good. We don't have a hardness on this, but that's okay. Transfer is fine. Okay, that should be fine. We can close that. We can actually close our layers as well at the moment. And what I want to do then is on these areas, basically these ridges, we're just going to go in and we're going to, using a small brush, we're just going to kind of paint along these edges. And basically we're just adding in, you know, kind of highlight lines of sorts. And you can do this using any number of techniques. This is one that works pretty well. But the other that works pretty well is we're going to go ahead and just hit Shift-Delete. And we're going to fill this entire layer with 50% gray. And then in the layer, we're going to set this to multiply. Or, excuse me, to overlay, sorry. And 50% gray and overlay is going to do absolutely nothing. But then as we add in black, it'll darken it. Or as we add in white, it'll lighten it. And so we're just going to then use our black and white brush to basically add in these highlights. You know, we don't want it to be white. You know, this is metal. It's not going to show just white along the edges. But where we add white, it'll easily add in basically highlights and allow us to just do all this real quick and easy. And we'll just add that little bit of extra variation. It'll make these details stand out. It'll seem a little bit more realistic. If you want to add, you know, a sharper, small line along the edge, that's good too, just to really make that pop up. If you hold down Shift, you can draw a straight line, which can make some of these lines a little bit easier. And if you ever need to go back, you know, just paint a little black on it, or go back to 50% gray, and you can just paint it in real easily. Okay, I'm not going to do too much of this while you're watching. I might pause the recording here in just a moment. But, you know, some of the areas that I want to think about is I want to add a little bit, you know, along here. Just add a little extra highlight in there that the ambient occlusion didn't get. Maybe even add some global highlight, you know, some larger ones to these ridges, like this. I can add some darker shadows to these areas, you know, basically strengthen the ambient occlusion. And, you know, you can really just kind of go through the model and figure out where you want, you know, some more highlights or shadows and just kind of roll with it. So here, you know, I want a little darker here. Maybe there, you know, water's dripping over this edge and kind of collecting underneath the edge. So I want a little darker there. Maybe I can add, you know, a little more darkness around the bottom side of the spouts. That's maybe a little much. Maybe it'll be a little lighter around the top. You know, the paint is getting more sun around there. Just to get a little bit more variation within the whole thing. And so what I'm going to do is real quick, I'm going to just pause the recording and I'm going to go through and paint in the rest of these highlights and then I'll be back with you. Okay, there we go. I got all of the highlights and shadows painted in. Now, one thing to note that since we're using an overlay layer here, if you really want deep shadows, you need to go ahead and use a multiply layer. Overlay does much better with the highlights. It doesn't really affect the blacks all that much. As you can see, if you look at the ridges here, you know, it just changes the tone a little bit. It doesn't really add deep dark shadows, but that's okay because we don't want deep dark shadows in this. But you can see kind of the highlights that I've added. Nothing too drastic, but enough to really kind of help give some attention to those and give us a nice result. So we're going to save out our PNG now and check it out in Blender. And that should do it for our texture map. The next part will be looking, or for our diffuse map, the next part we're going to go ahead and add in our spec map so that we can get some good specular variation in there. And then we'll look at combining the two normal maps. And then finally, we're going to bring it all into Unity and show it in a real-time environment. Alrighty, we've just finished our diffuse map, and what I want to do now is I want to create the spec map. The way that we'll do this, and by the way, we do still have some stuff that we could do with the diffuse, but in the interest of time, I'm going to go ahead and just leave it out. So all these other layers in here are basically just our miscellaneous layers that we will probably we might use later, but for the time being, we're going to leave them be. To do the spec map, what I'm going to do is I'm going to group all of these layers together. So I'm going to select them all. I'm going to hit Command G and group them. And I'm going to then rename this to be diffuse. Then I'm going to hit Command J to duplicate this entire group. And this is going to then be my spec. And what I'm going to do on the spec is I'm going to start by, first of all, we don't need any of these layers. So we can just delete those out of the spec group. And we don't need the rust spots. So we can just delete that as well. And then what we'll do is we're going to start by desaturating all of our colors to make sure that we don't have any color values in those. We only want the tones. And then we also don't need the whites because basically the spec map is going to work by anything that is white or greater than 50% or greater than black will show up. Anything that's black will not show up. So we don't need the white, so we can just toggle off that layer. We don't want it. And then these ridges, the blacks are way too dark. Let's see, actually, why are those all that dark? Tell you what, let's do this. Let's select, let me try something. Let's try selecting these two. We're going to hit Command E, merge those two together. Nope, we're not going to do that. Instead, in this layer, we're going to hit Command L, bring up the output level of the blacks. That will bring up all of those just a little bit. Click OK. Then we can toggle those off, and that will then work a little nicer. Now we can tone down the opacity of this a little bit. These look a little messy now suddenly, now that we can see them so clearly, so we could maybe clean up a few of those just by selecting a, just select this base color here. We'll alt-right click, select that, and then go back in here, and then let's just kind of paint over a couple of these just to soften them up just a bit. All right, that ought to be fine. Nothing too drastic. Again, these are only going to show up as highlights, so those aren't going to show up as bright white lines. It's just going to show up when we have spec. So that's probably okay. Then what I want to do is we're going to take this layer, and we don't want the majority of this layer here. So let's hit Command L. We're going to bring up the levels. Let's just bring in the blacks. And basically, we just want these smudges and things like that to show up. And that's probably going to be... We bring these in. Tell you what, let's invert this layer because we want basically the scratches and scuff marks on this to show up. So things like these dings, the edges of those should show up. So if we invert this layer, then hit Command L, then bring in the blacks, then you can see how all of a sudden those all start to show up. We can bring down the white maximum. It doesn't need to be nearly that bright. And then we can bring some of these in, bring the blacks in further, bring the whites in. And this will just kind of give us a good kind of overall kind of spec tone here with a couple of brighter spots that I think will work quite well. That'll be fine. Then let's grab the ridges here, and we're going to rasterize, or no, I guess I can't really rasterize that, but what we can do is we can merge this down with this layer here. So let's actually, if we duplicate this a couple of times, we can make that far more severe, and then we can select all these, then hit Command E and bring them down, and then we can overlay them again. Bring up the levels. Set that back to overlay. There we go. I missed one. Bring up the levels. Bring in the darks a bit. Bring in the whites. Take the midtones over. Help kind of show some of those highlights and such. Bring in the darks bit more. Actually, no, that's not really working very well. Tell you what, let's undo each of those. Let's take this back. Just try and get just the whites in here. There we go. That works pretty well. Just to add a little bit more, highlight to the ridges there. Yeah, I think that'll work. Okay, that looks pretty good. The AO is fine. Then let's, if we want, we can manually paint in a few more highlights. You can add another layer, and then just using the brush tool, if you wanted to paint some more highlights, say around some of these ridges here, that would not be a bad idea and would work quite well to help show some of the different surfaces. Maybe along some of these lines here. Those tops of the bolts maybe. Something like this. And these, just make them show up a little bit more, particularly with the tops of the bolts here, since they are not actually included in the actual surface. If we can make those pop a little bit more, that's going to help, sell the deal. We can bring up these ridges a little bit more. Maybe a line across there. Again, kind of just manually adding in where some of the highlights would go on the actual surface that we don't have otherwise. Is really going to help convince the viewer that this has a lot more detail than it actually has. Okay, I think that'll be a good starting point. We can at least see what that looks like. Add that there. Okay, so we're going to save this. Save the PNG, which remember, if we just turn off this spec layer, then we've got everything that we originally had, or save the PSD. Then we'll go ahead and save a PNG of the hydrant underscore spec, just like that. It'll save out here in a moment. And then one thing that we're going to do is we're going to duplicate this layer now, and we're going to hit Command E to merge all those down. and we're going to select everything and copy it. And this, what we're going to do here in a sec, is all in preparation of using this in Unity. So Unity has an interesting way of basically conserving memory for textures, because every additional texture map that you have is going to take more memory. So what it does is when you use a bumped specular shader in Unity, it allows you to have a diffuse channel and a normal map channel, and then it finds the gloss via the alpha channel in the diffuse. So if we go in over to the channels folder or channels section, add in a new layer, which will immediately add in an alpha channel, and then just paste that in, that's going to put the spec map into the alpha channel of our image. And in fact, if we go like this, we can see the spec map overlaid there. And that then will use that as the actual glossy map for Unity. So this way, you don't actually have a spec map. We just saved out a spec map so that then we can go in Unity or in Blender here, increase our specular intensity, or actually turn that down to 0, sorry. So we set that to 0. We go over to the textures. Let's pull those down a notch. There we go. We're going to add in a new layer. This is going to be an image. We're going to go ahead and open an image. And we're going to pull in our spec. We'll click open. And we're going to do the normal thing, set it to UV. And we're going to turn off color. We're going to turn on specular. And then we're going to set RGB to intensity. And so now only those areas that were black or white are going to show up. Now this, we may not have made that strong enough, so let's increase the intensity a little bit to kind of see what it looks like. And then one of the things that we can do to see how we did is if we select the sun lamp now and just double tap R, we can kind of rotate it around and kind of see how our spec map appears. It's not super detailed, but it works pretty well, I think. You can see some variation, right in here, rather than before it was just super soft. And then one thing that we can do too is right now we got a very soft spec. So if we increase the hardness of the spec, that will give us a slightly better realistic result. You can see kind of the noisiness in the spec map. So that works pretty well. If we want to increase this, we can increase this to whatever we want. In this case, probably just leaving it at 1 will be fine. So that gives us a pretty nice result. Let's go ahead and save this now. So we'll save our file. And I think we're going to be ready to start, or almost ready to start loading this into Unity. We need to do one more thing, and that's what we're going to do in the next video, is to actually go in. We got some seams here that we could take care of, but we're not going to worry about them for the time being. It's basically just a matter of going into Blender and cloning those out. But what we're going to do is we're going to add in our existing normal map, and we're going to add in a detail map to it. And we're going to do that via an application called Crazy Bump. Okay, so to get more detail in our normal map, we're going to use an application called Crazy Bump, which works on Mac and Windows. It's available from crazybump.com. It is a paid application, but you can find a full demo version for Windows, and it's in public beta for Mac right now. It's a very simple application that really does wonders. It's very economical. If you check the license, professional $2.99, personal $99, and students are $49. Quite economical, all things considered, because it really does ease the process of what we're about to do a lot. And what we're going to do basically is, first of all, in Photoshop, we're going to basically create a detail map, which is essentially our spec map, but we're going to do it differently. So we're just going to duplicate our diffuse, and we're just going to call this bump. And we're going to Command-Shift-U, or actually we've got to go into our colors. We're going to get rid of these layers again because we don't need them. There we are. Delete those. We're going to hit Command-Shift-U, desaturate this. We don't need the white, so we're going to get rid of it. And actually, we're going to select this and this. We're going to hit Command-E, merge those down, get rid of the white. No, we're not going to do that. We're going to do, we're going to desaturate this. We're going to get rid of our highlights here. And then, there we are. Okay. So this gives us this. On our ambient occlusion, we're going to hit Command-L, bring up our levels, and we're just going to push things a bit, because basically what we want to do is we just want to get our shapes more clearly defined. something a bit like this, and then we also want our detail more clearly defined. So that will probably work pretty well there. And then on our grunge base, we're going to hit Command L, and we're going to bring each of the layers in, or each of the points, and just try and get kind of our detail to show up a little bit more. Something like this should be fine. Okay, and then on this one, we're also going to bring in the levels a bit. Something like this, just to make those pop a bit more. And that ought to be pretty good. Okay, so we're going to click OK. Then we're going to toggle this down. And then we're going to hit Command-Shift-S. We're going to save out a PNG. And this is going to be our hydrant underscore bump. And as soon as that saves out, we can go ahead and toggle this off. We don't care about that. If we look at this, one thing I did want to add in, I did realize that on our spec that we hadn't really touched these. So I might do that just real quick. Kind of pull some of those in, which I believe we're not seeing because of that being on. We're not going to worry about it for the time being. So we're just going to hide that, hide that, hide that, bring back the bump, bring back those. Okay, save our file. We saved out the PNG. So going into Crazy Bump, which by the way, you can see that we can't quite see this because it's too low, or the Crazy Bump is not able to scale down the window. It's a very simple application, doesn't have some of that. But the open command is actually right down here on the bottom left. It's basically the only button. And we're just going to click Open Photograph from File. We're going to go in here, choose our textures, and we're going to choose Bump right here. And wait for it. It's thinking, and we are instructed to wait at being puny humans apparently. Okay, so when you open Crazy Bump then, you're given two options. This shape or this shape. Now you can modify this later on, but basically you want to choose the shape that best represents your form. And in this case, it's this one. Because this is raised, these are raised, those are inset. Perfect. Okay. We do have a 3D preview and then a options down here. Now we're going to hide the preview because it doesn't fit in our recording. And basically you can see exactly what it's doing already. Basically it's taking all of the levels and such, and if it's black, it's pushing one way, if it's white, it's pushing it the other way, and just trying to get you this extra detail in the normal map. Really, really cool. Number one, we have a problem though, is that it's detecting these edges here. And this is primarily due to the shape recognition, because basically it's seeing that, hey, you have all this black in here, and we want to detect it. So really, if you want to do some extra little cleanup time, all this black should be filled with your base color here. But we're not going to worry about that because we're just going to turn shape recognition off. That will take care of most of that. And then we're also going to turn all very large detail off, all large detail off, and probably medium detail. Because that's then just about going to get rid of all of those edges. And if we turn all those off, then you can see exactly what happens. We can then increase very fine detail, and this is really what we want in here. We want this fine detail, extra patterns that gives us all this kind of grunge map in here. We don't really care about the big shapes because those are controlled by a regular normal map. We can adjust the intensity here. In this case, we're going to make it really strong, because then what we're going to do is we're going to open up the normal map mixer. What this allows us to do is add in another map. We're going to choose normals from file, and this is why we originally called it Hydrant Normal Main, because we're going to open this, and then it mixes those two together. So we can set our main one to full strength, and then this one to subtle strength. Now, let's open this up just to double check. That actually, you can see that looks just about right. It might be a little too strong. We could take this down just a little bit. Maybe right about in there will probably be pretty good. And then we can take this strength way down, so it's basically blending those two together. And this is exactly why we're using Crazy Bump right here versus something else. It allows us to blend the two together very easily. And that'll probably be good. So let's just close this. We can show the 3D preview if you want. You can kind of see what it's supposed to look like. If you right click and drag, you can change the light on it. You can change the options here to include the diffuse color if you want. Because if you actually go in and go into the diffuse, you can load a diffuse texture. And in this case, we'll just choose our diffuse.png. It will load that in, and now you can see exactly what your normal map looks like. So you can see how it's adding this extra roughness to it, and it just looks pretty extra awesome. We can see some extra grit or grunge detail. We can change this type over to a box if we wanted to see it flat. So really, really awesome. In this case, we'll do column. That's probably the most accurate. Cool. So we can, again, adjust the lighting, see what it looks like from various angles, and that looks pretty awesome. So we're going to close out of this, and then under the Normals tab, by the way, we can also create specularity channels from this as well, but they don't, I'm not generally too impressed with the specular channels from Crazy Bump, but you can play with it. You can also play with ambient occlusion and displacement, but normally I just use the Normals channel. But once this is done, we have a save button down here at the bottom right, which again, I know you can't really see, but it's there. I'll click save. Oh wait, no, those are preferences, I'm sorry. Save is actually right in here. You can see it right there. It's a little folder icon. So save normals to file. And this time, this is just going to be our hydrant _ normal. And we're going to save this. And then in Blender, we're going to open it up, and we're just going to replace our existing normal map file. So we'll just go in here and choose hydrant _ normal.png. And now you can see how we have all that extra detail in there. Now, this is probably a bit too strong. However, from my experience in Unity, Unity's normal maps tend to be pretty weak in comparison to, say, Blender and such. And so don't worry that this is extra strong. We can always tone it down later. So let's just leave that as is, and we're ready to jump right into Unity.